Welcome, research assistants.
Since coming to Netflix earlier this year, NBC's Community has quickly become one of my all-time favourite TV shows. What starts out as a fairly conventional sitcom about a group of adults in a classic high school setting quickly gives way to pure, childlike inventiveness, as Greendale Community College is overrun with paintball wars, lava floors, and blanket forts. Such insanity might easily have proven too conceptual to follow, but what holds it all together is the organic approach to storytelling that creator Dan Harmon brought to every episode of the show that he worked on. A lot of great videos have already been made regarding Harmon's near-religious application of his story circle in the development of Rick and Morty, but in this video, I want to take a look at how this unique approach helped put Community streets ahead of other shows in terms of that elusive, magical quality that can only be described as heart.
Better yet, before we do that, let's ask ourselves, what is a story?
For those who aren't aware, the story circle is a method that Harmon devised in order to remove a lot of the repetitive work from structuring stories. It draws heavily from the works of Joseph Campbell, who studied the underlying patterns shared across many myths and fairy tales to create what is commonly known nowadays as the hero's journey. However, while Campbell's circle can include up to 17 stages, Harmon strips these down to the bare essentials, resulting in the following 8-step structure. First, you establish a protagonist. Then, you give them a need, something that's lacking in their life. Next, you force them to go out of their comfort zone and into an unfamiliar world, a world to which they must now adapt as they search to fulfill their need. Eventually, the protagonist finds the thing they needed, even if it's not what they thought they needed, and takes it, paying a heavy price. Equipped with this newfound tool, they return to where they started, having changed. This approach may seem formulaic at first glance, and there's certainly a lot of debate as to which kinds of story it applies to. However, what makes this the perfect narrative framework for a half-hour, feel-good comedy series like Community is that it contains all of the necessary steps for what K.M. Weiland calls the positive change arc, in which a protagonist ends their story a better person than when they started. The circular structure, meanwhile, helps to ensure that although the characters may grow and change, the overall status quo is restored by the end of each episode, a crucial component of any long-running sitcom.
6 seasons in a movie. 6 seasons in a movie.
Using the story circle as a blueprint, Harmon would famously rewrite each episode of Community until he was satisfied that every A, B, and C story more or less adhered to this structure. By assessing each subplot against his 8-step criteria, he was able to weave as many complete story arcs into an episode as possible, and it's this heightened focus on storytelling that makes Community a great sitcom, even at its most conventional. This is perhaps best illustrated by the high quality of the show's comparatively orthodox first season, which skillfully juggles the stories of all 7 protagonists while simultaneously serving as our introduction to each of them. These early episodes are loaded with great character moments, from small, satisfying payoffs like Abed's Batman rescue, to surprisingly insightful revelations, like Troy's confession that he deliberately injured himself to escape the pressure of a high school football game, or Shirley's realization that she's been projecting her anger over her husband's affair onto Professor Slater. The clearest way to define a character is through their actions within a story, and by the end of the episode Debate 109, I felt as though I'd already developed a pretty solid understanding of the entire main cast. This kind of understanding is integral to the comedy of Community, because a lot of the show's funniest moments come from seeing these characters act in ways that are either distinctly in character,
I don't like being excluded, Jeff, do you? Yes!
or surprisingly out of character.
Troy and Abed being normal.
But at the same time, Harmon's perfectionist approach to narrative ensures that even when Community isn't firing off jokes at the same rate as something like Arrested Development, it still has a lot more to offer than most other sitcoms when it comes to great storytelling.
Everything's a story, Jeff. Getting out of bed is a story. Certainly this is a story.
Of course, Community is rarely content with being just another well-written sitcom. After a couple of ventures into homage territory near the end of Season 1, the show's remaining 5 seasons adopt what is roughly a 4-3 split between regular sitcom episodes and high-concept episodes, with the latter spanning countless genres and formal experiments across the series' run. This constant reinvention might easily have stripped the show of any sense of cohesion or identity, but it's here that the story circle provides a much-needed anchor. See, another advantage of the circle is that it can be divided into segments, which Harmon uses to help determine the structure and pacing of his stories. In a 2013 blog post, he breaks down Advanced Dungeons & Dragons with respect to the story circle, stating that back in Season 2 this was probably about identifying act breaks, i.e. asking, what new world are we entering, and what's the worst thing that can happen there? This means that whenever the characters cross an important narrative threshold, the episode cuts to an ad break. Or, if you're watching on Netflix like me, we just cut to black for a second. In cooperative calligraphy, for example, the first act break occurs when Jeff orders the study room into lockdown, signifying the group's descent into an unfamiliar world of paranoia.
I'm doing a bottle episode.
In a more high-concept episode, this would be the moment in Basic Rocket Science when the group are towed away in the Winnebago, or the 8-day time jump in Amp Development and Condiments that sees Greendale succumb to a rigid class hierarchy. As Harmon points out, it doesn't matter how small or large the scope of your story is. What matters is the amount of contrast between these worlds. The second act break then marks a return to relative normality, occurring directly after the part of the episode where the characters have paid a heavy price. For a regular sitcom episode, an example of this would be when Annie and Jeff embarrass themselves during the Model UN contest in Geography of Global Conflict.
You're acting like a little schoolgirl, and not in a hot way.
But even the highest of concept episodes has a low point. In Epidemiology, we see this when Troy is left to fend for himself against the zombie horde. And it's no coincidence that the second act break in Remedial Chaos Theory comes just after we're shown the darkest timeline. Overall, the structure of a standard 21-minute Community episode strongly resembles the classic Hollywood 3-act structure of setup, confrontation and resolution that was popularised by Sid Field's book, Screenplay. By adapting the story circle to fit this model, Harmon was able to homogenise the structure and pacing of both kinds of episode without compromising on the versatility of their content, which is partially why Community still feels like Community even when it's switching between genres like the Dean switches costumes.
Well, I guess we don't see our patterns until they're all laid out in front of us.
The final major aspect that gives this show its unique sense of heart is one that most sitcoms strive to avoid: change. In keeping with the educational nature of the setting, each episode of Community provides its characters with valuable lessons on how best to lead their lives, and the show's willingness to let them gradually mature as they learn from these lessons is one of its greatest assets. The story circle is Harmon's way of visualising these incremental changes in character, and its symmetry is of use here once again. By drawing a line from the beginning of a story down to its midpoint, one arrives at the pivotal moment in which the protagonist finds the thing they needed. K.M. Weiland calls this the moment of truth, because it's often the point where the character embraces a certain reality that they've previously been ignoring. In Introduction to Teaching, for example, this occurs when Jeff realises that he might actually enjoy teaching.
Because they draw a circle around something called the truth.
And accepts that students and teachers don't need to be enemies, a fact which he later uses to quell the student riots with a classic Winger speech.
We all have something in common, too. We all suck.
The vertical division of the story circle thus marks an important shift in the characters' beliefs, as they replace the lie that was hindering them with the truth that will allow them to change. Harmon then combines this with the horizontal division between worlds to split the circle into 4 distinct quadrants, each representing an important stage in the protagonist's journey. In his words, the more important use of quadrants is in creating or checking for what the suits call arcs. You go through the story in the shoes of any particular character and ask yourself what's changing from top to bottom and from left to right as they move through the plot.
That's my arc.
That's your arc.
The result of this is that every episode of Community is about something, whether it's Abed coming to terms with Troy's departure in geothermal escapism, or Jeff learning to accept that there won't be a season 7 in emotional consequences of broadcast television. Not only does this serve to ground the high-concept episodes by adding meaningful stakes, but it also elevates the regular sitcom episodes into stories of substance, with my favourite example of this being Season 2's Mixology certification. Let's go around the study table and see how this episode uses the story circle to give each of its characters a complete arc. The cold open establishes that it's Troy's birthday, setting him up as the main protagonist of the episode. Upon discovering that he's actually turning 21, the legal drinking age, Troy states his need.
Yes, I want to bathe in manhood.
Although he doesn't quite know what this means yet. To celebrate, the entire study group goes to a bar, which serves as a physical manifestation of this episode's unfamiliar world. Notice that as soon as all of the characters apart from Pierce have entered the bar, we enter Act 2. The unfamiliar world of the bar represents something different for each character. For Troy, this is the promised land of adulthood and alcohol, the two of which are essentially synonymous in his eyes. He begins his search here by listening to Jeff and Britta's advice on the social rules of drinking, but eventually he starts to tire of their lecturing.
Hurricanes are bad, Troy.
I know.
He then witnesses the negative effects of alcohol after a quarrel with Shirley results in her leaving early. Although his drunken mentors display no remorse, Troy certainly does. At midnight, Troy finds what he wanted when he finally breaks free of Jeff and Britta and orders himself a drink of his own choice. However, as he looks around and sees his sullen friends scattered about the bar, he realises the truth that he's been missing, that to be a man isn't about adhering to superficial cultural norms, but about being responsible. Although it costs him both his first legal drink and his old, idealistic perception of manhood, Troy chooses to take responsibility for his friends and drive them home. The third act begins once the characters have left the bar, signalling a return to the familiar world of everyday life. Troy reasserts his newfound truth when it turns out that the two bars Jeff and Britta have been arguing about all night are actually one and the same.
I just spent the last 2 years thinking that you guys knew more than me about life. And I just found out that you guys are just as dumb as me.
After delivering a reassuring speech to Annie, he proceeds to drive the others home, having changed from boy to man. Abed's initial need in this episode, by contrast, is to avoid adulthood. This becomes increasingly apparent throughout his story, but it's hinted at early on by how little he interacts with Troy on his birthday, presumably due to the fear of watching his best friend outgrow him. For Abed, the adult world of the bar is merely a distraction from the fantasy realm of pop culture that he prefers to live in, and so it makes sense that his first instinct is to search for comfort in the form of an arcade game.
They have asteroids. Slide out.
Okay. Okay.
Abed then finds a surrogate Troy in a stranger called Robert, but as the pair innocently chat about their mutual love of science fiction, it transpires that Robert is actually hitting on him, which carries the unfortunate truth that some aspects of adulthood simply cannot be avoided forever. Instead of outright rejecting Robert's advances, however, Abed chooses to feign ignorance for as long as possible so that he can continue talking about TV shows, which ultimately leads to him getting a drink thrown in his face.
I really like talking about Farscape.
Upon returning to the outside world, Abed is subjected to some more mature content, but when Troy tells him off as a parent would, he smiles, finally accepting the fact that his friend is growing up.
Abed, no one likes a tattletale.
Jeff and Britta undergo two identical arcs in this episode, so it's useful to look at them together. Their need is established at the end of the cold open, with a nice little joke that sets up the idea of them both competing to exert their influence over Troy, which is what they'll be doing throughout the majority of the A story.
Troy.
For Jeff and Britta, the bar itself is a familiar world, but the study group being there is not, and they adapt to this by showing off their knowledge of the adult world in front of their friends, spouting empty wisdom to Troy about what drink he should choose. An earlier draft of the script for this episode placed greater emphasis on the face-off against Shirley, with her accusing the drunken pair of being bad role models for Troy. This line would presumably have served as Jeff and Britta's moment of truth, and while its omission from the finished episode leaves their story without an obvious midpoint, I think its original inclusion shows how hard the community writers try to give everyone a complete story arc, even if not everything makes the final cut. Despite this, there is still a shift in power dynamics when the pair relinquish control to Troy, as he guides Britta out of the bar with Jeff's car keys in hand. Upon returning to the outside world, Jeff remains surprisingly calm when he realises that Troy is driving his car, something that he never would have allowed a few hours ago.
Maybe later you'll let me drive your car.
He and Britta both seem guilty about having given Troy such a disappointing night,
Happy birthday, Troy.
but they now accept that he's his own man.
You're a man now.
Annie's story in this episode begins with her need to have everything planned out, which causes her to panic about illegally using someone else's ID.
I'm not a relaxed person, Britta. I think ahead. I prepare.
For her, the bar represents an unexpected opportunity to assume the identity of someone more laid back, namely Caroline Decker from Corpus Christi, Texas. She adapts by committing to the role of Caroline, adopting a Texas accent along with new vocabulary and mannerisms. At the midpoint, Annie becomes totally comfortable in the persona of Caroline, finally learning to relax and enjoy herself.
Annie's the one who plans things, not me.
But with this new perspective comes the realization that she doesn't like her regular self, leaving her in an identity crisis.
I got no place to be. What am I, Annie?
Returning to her apartment building, she confesses to Troy that she pretended to be someone else out of uncertainty. But after he describes his own caring perception of her, she becomes visibly more comfortable with her true self.
You expect yourself to be better than everyone, which is cool.
Shirley's need in this episode is to conceal the truth about her alcoholic past from her friends. This is first foreshadowed when she suggests that they go to a non-alcoholic bar, and again when she speaks out against going to the ballroom specifically. For Shirley, this bar is one that she frequented during her worst years, and thus represents the hidden past that she is trying to repress.
Shirley, welcome back. You don't know me.
Upon discovering an old, embarrassing photograph of herself on the wall, Shirley searches the rest of the bar for any more incriminating evidence. She eventually seems to have taken down every photo, only to find that Britta has retrieved one from the ladies' room, outing her secret. This leads to a confrontation that ends with Shirley storming out of the bar, returning to the present. Writer Andy Bobrow has shared a deleted end tag for this episode that would have seen Troy, Abed and Shirley using the photographs of her as playing cards. It's a shame that this was cut, because it would have resolved Shirley's story arc by showing her embracing the past rather than burying it, but it's still impressive that an attempt was made to provide closure even for a small subplot like this one. Lastly, Pierce starts this episode with a need to prove his independence, having recently become wheelchair-bound after breaking both legs in a trampolining accident. He first refuses help from Shirley while struggling to cut Troy's cake,
I broke my legs, not my gender.
and later does the same again when she offers him a lift to the bar.
Pierce, do you want to ride in my van?
I'm not a disabled.
Although Pierce never quite enters the bar, the entrance itself acts as his unfamiliar world, confronting him with his own incapability as he fails to maneuver through the door. He once again refuses help, this time from the bouncer, but when the battery on his wheelchair runs out, he's forced to come to terms with the truth of his dependence on others. This results in an embarrassing moment when Shirley finds him during her exit, but Pierce finally admits that he needs her to push him. Reluctantly, she agrees, and the two return to the outside world, with Pierce having learned to accept help.
Thank you, Shirley.
Welcome, jackass.
Ultimately, Harmon's Circle is just one of the many different ways to look at story structure, but I think what his work demonstrates is that when a writer finds the approach that works best for them and for their story, the results can be outstanding. Change was always at the heart of Community, from changing genres to changing cast members to characters changing one another, and the Story Circle is all about formalising said change.
It's just a circle. It's a circle.
By providing a story structure that was uniform yet universal, the Circle allowed each episode's content to move freely within its framework, resulting in a show that can jump from regular sitcom to high-concept homage effortlessly. Where most sitcoms would settle for less, the quantity of Community's character arcs makes full use of its ensemble cast, and where most sitcoms would dare not go, the quality of these arcs keeps the stories grounded in real emotional stakes. It may be a long time before we get another show as inventive as this one, but I look forward to seeing how Dan Harmon scales up his Story Circle for that inevitable movie.
Leonard likes this post.
Subscribe.